Hello and welcome to the roundtable discussion held by the Center for New Economic Studies, under which it's nickel and dime, and this is the Environment and Social Issues cluster. And the topic we are discussing today is the OBOR policy by China. So just to give an introduction on what the topic is, China's One Belt, One Road policy, like many of its others, is largely influenced by economic motives and ease of trade across the continent of Asia, Africa, and Europe. It's heavily based on the Silk Road, which was the first global trade route in history. And but like almost all other development projects in the recent times, it is also set to negatively impact environment across the countries that it is affiliated with. So today we will be discussing sort of the effects of the same. So to open up, so the discussion, asking questions to the panelists, who are the members of the cluster, we'll be starting off with, I just want to sort of understand at the beginning itself, when the OBOR policy was sort of advertised, because it has a lot of sort of advertising backing behind it. It was the brainchild of China, and it is a big and very ambitious project. So initially, when it was advertised, I just want to know if it was advertised as something ecologically positive, or was the negative effects acknowledged during that time? Did they mention like the environmental impact?
When China started this project, they said that it would be low carbon, green, and sustainable, but it has been anything but that. Many BRI projects have involved pushing roads and rail freights lines through some of the world's biologically richest places, which is obviously not very ecologically positive.
Right. Would anyone else like to add on to that?
Sure. China was obviously advertising it as such a huge investment and economic project, right? But what's interesting is that United Nations Environment Program, right, UNEP, it kind of like collaborated with China. It's not collaborated, but like they created this kind of like coalition. It's called the BRI, International Green Development Coalition, in which like, they have talked about how, they're going to like make it sustainable because it's such a huge economic and infrastructure project, right? So they must make it like economically sustainable and like try to introduce more policy and dialogue. But again, I just feel like it's just been advertisement and just to kind of like give it a justification on the brief like service level, and nothing really has really come out of it.
So you're saying it was mostly like just conversations happening of the environment impact and nothing on ground was done about it. Yeah, that's fair. Kripa, Shreya, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think along the lines of what Ajisha shared, there was another, I think, Belt and Road Ecological and Environmental Cooperation Plan. That was, I think, from the Chinese government itself. But even their what they've laid out seems very superficial. Like, what exactly does eco-friendly infrastructure mean when you're breaking down so like a very huge length of like environment and displacing people and forests and the biodiversity? Like, what exactly would eco-friendly ever fit in? There's just eco everywhere in the form, but like what exactly is that? It's yeah, it's quite bizarre when you like read even the UN documents and all of that.
Yeah, so it's the sort of the use of language, right, to convey that there is an environmental backing behind all this, but it isn't really there. And the word eco is used a lot, that too very sparingly and often without any sort of scientific or even on ground evidence of the same. Shreya, did you want to add anything, or Lavanya?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that even though this project is not like, outrightly shown as ecologically positive, but somewhere in its official documents and statements, they have said that OBOR does talk about climate change and there's like a need to protect the environment. But it's all on the surface level. Beneath it, when we look into this, there's no policy guidance on whether, the impact assessments of these, the environmental impact assessments of these project is not there. And when we have like a closer look on the policies, they do more harm to the environment and the good that they have promised to. And it's more ecologically damaging for the host countries. And yeah, and like we can see, so I found one article while doing research that said that China has promised to move away from, conventional sources of energy and focus on non-conventional sources of energy and all that stuff while doing the power plant projects under this OBOR policy, but it's still focusing on fossil fuels as a source of energy in the China-Pakistan economic corridor that it's building. So, so it's very surface level, and even though they have advertised that they're ecologically positive, they are not really implementing their promises.
Right. And you mentioned, impact assessment, and I think that's an interesting point because one of the biggest arguments, right, is for say any development project is we have to see at the ground level what impact it has had, right? But that sort of impact assessment is not possible with such a large and like wide-ranging project across countries, right? Even if you do a country level impact assessment, that's not really feasible, right? So I think that's a sort of an added problem in this particular development project. Say if you compare it to the usual within India, say a dam is being built and that is sort of disrupting a river, its ecosystem, or the livelihoods of the people around it. That impact assessment in and around the area of the dam can be done feasibly, but it's not possible, right, in this sort of development project. So even when they are suggesting some sort of ecological backing or environmental impact assessment, it's helpful to think about whether at all it is feasible. So that's great. If there's nothing else to add, then so you talked about China because that is where this policy. But I was just thinking about if there's any such project initiated by any other country, and how it might be different when such a trade mogul such as China is announcing such a big project related to it, to fulfill or to further its economic aims. What might be the politics behind China announcing such a project as opposed to say any other country? But if any other country, the project with this model.
So the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment was actually started by the US as in response to the OBOR with other G7 countries in 2022. They launched it in July, very recently. And the idea is to loan money to develop infrastructure projects in developing nations, sort of basically the same idea as China. PJII is another version of the Build Back Better World, which was unveiled at the G7 summit. And the project aims to invest around $600 billion as opposed to China's investment of $1 trillion, so that they can offer alternative trade routes to developing nations, so that Chinese initiative does not get that much traction. But rather than the difference is where instead of loaning money to other countries to build roads, railways, ports, dams, this way they're going to try to counter that by financing soft projects such as industrial scale solar plants, a vaccine manufacturing center in Africa, and digital infrastructure linking Asia and Africa together. And so far they have pledged to raise $200 billion. And it looks on the surface to be more environmentally friendly because they are trying to ensure global energy security through clean energy supply chains. But again, it's very vague what they have proposed till now. So we can only wait and see if it actually is any difference between this and China's OBOR.
Yeah, that's a fair point, right? There's a lot of international relations sort of rivalries, especially between US and China. You're talking about the respective hegemons in the West and the East. That sort of politics that comes in. Any other point? Any other panelists? Yeah. So one counter, right, I had to this, and you can respond as you see fit, is these development focused projects. So one of the biggest, I won't say complaint because it's valid, of developing countries is that we have not reached the United States level or the China level of economic growth. So when they tell us to be renewable at the cost of growth, it is not really fair, right? So when these countries are providing these sort of development aid, is that necessarily wrong? And do you think so? And if so, why? Is this sort of to play devil's advocate? Because mostly the biggest complaint of developing countries is, okay, you're telling us to stop using coal, to be more renewable, to be more green, but we are not as developed as you, so why should we do that? But we also complain if they are giving us development projects, like sort of aid for development, right? So there's this sort of trade-off. So any opinions on that?
I think it's not necessarily wrong because US has had decades to develop on fossil fuels, and now it is their time to shift to renewable energy. And it is also their obligation if they're telling other countries who haven't developed as much, they have to provide the resources. But I think with China, what they're doing is with the loan, it also comes the fact that China is trying to develop its own economy more than it's trying to help others. That little self-interest that is, I think that is the problem most people have with the project. It's not the fact that they're giving money and helping developing countries develop on sustainable energy. That's good, and that should happen more, but it should also happen on good faith and not self-interest, just better development. When it is on self-interest, that's when people have a problem with it.
Right, that's fair. Archisha, Kripashpriya, any comments to add?
Yeah, I'll just like add on to it. Like you talked about self-interested, and I completely agree with it on that part. Like there's a World Bank report also, which has like analyzed all the investment projects that are coming in OBOR and Belt and Road Initiative, right? We see that all these projects are actually being taken place in which the environment regulations are weaker. I mean, they're weaker mainly because obviously they might not be like as aware or as like in development of the environment laws as like the other countries. So what China is doing, it's not that it wants to like be sustainable or like want to like encourage the growth of other countries. What it really wants is to essentially bypass its own strict laws and get profits from like other countries where the economic and environment regulations are weaker. So that's a major point over here.
Right, that's a fair point to add on. So moving on, so this is the most general question I wanted to sort of end on this, is what are some broader factors you can think of which could arise as a con for implementation of the BRI? So it could be more related to the social side, and if you could maybe give sort of country specific, the economies, environment, general social scenario, that would also be great.
Okay, so the major brunt or the OBOR policy falls on like the fragile Southeast Asian countries, more like Indonesia or Malaysia, Cambodia. So when compared to China's developed economy, they are lagging behind, right? And implementation of such projects in their country would mean development and more jobs for the people, more exposure. So the cost of this, when seen with the cost of environmental degradation, they feel that this is such a, as you nicely said, it's a trade-off, right? It's a fair trade-off for them. And that's why they do not pay much heed to environmental degradation. And for example, so in Indonesia, which is a developing economy, and there was a dam that was supposed to be constructed on the island of Sumatra. And under the OBOR policy, it was seen that it posed serious threat to the wildlife and the jungle ecosystem, to the habitats of animals there, which is why it was stopped, it was stalled, and also in Myanmar, a hydroelectric dam was being constructed, and that was also stalled due to its severe impacts on the environment. So OBORs, like previously, I think Sanjana and Archisha mentioned. So China's OBOR comes across as a policy that wants to assist the developing nations to develop, but actually, it's a policy which comes at the cost of economic manipulation and environmental degradation of host countries, like especially the South Asian countries like Myanmar and Cambodia. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair point, especially it seems like in taking advantage of the position that the smaller emerging economies are in and using that to the advantage of the Chinese to set up a better trade route for themselves. Any other point?
Adding to that, on a more general note, increasing access to underdeveloped areas of forests will also increase the likelihood of poaching and deforestation in those areas. And unless proper safeguards are implemented, which so far they haven't been, the ecological impacts along the BRI's corridor could be extremely considerable, and they haven't taken any steps to take care of that so far.
So, Kripa, anything you want to add on?
Yeah, so just let me know if I'm breaking because like I can't hear you guys properly also. Okay, yeah. So like here, again on a general note, um just like we've seen this in the pandemic and like we're eating in on more like nature, like we're eating in on the forest, we're like being more exposed to like different organisms that we are not immune to. And like this is making a path to connect like so many countries. It can also pose a really huge health risk for all of us. And that's something which I which is never taken into consideration until like pandemics happen and epidemics happen, but like it's happened enough for us to acknowledge it now. And also something that maybe I don't know country specific here, but like just the land politics that ties into this, right? Maybe what we could also like look into is um what zones are being made into SCZs, like exactly what, like who are these, like what's the socioeconomic backgrounds of people living in these lands, and who are the targets to such like destruction, like, and considering that these are like really diverse countries, I'm sure like there would be one particular group or like a couple particular groups being affected more than the rich in the country, right? And also like who exactly is benefiting from here. Yes, it's overall giving an economic boost to all countries, but like out of these countries, who is it that it's benefiting? Who are getting these jobs? Who are profiting out of these? These are like really important questions we'll have to ask about this project.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, especially given the COVID situation, we understand how quickly a health risk can pass out. It's like one of the cons of globalization. And obviously, this sort of trade route will only expand that. Archisha, any final thoughts?
I mean, yeah, just like adding on to like all of these points, right? And like another factor that we have to consider is that it's like a huge infrastructure project. And so there will be a lot of transfer of resources from here to there. And like, again, the transportation costs and like the transportation environment cost should also be taken into consideration. Because if you're like distributing resources and, your pollutants, which are, emissions of CO2, hydrocarbons, and, all of these gases will also increase. And what it will end up doing is, again, like we have heard about, IPCC and like again, carbon emissions and just increase of all of that. And again, that just has a general effect on like throughout the globe.
Right. So that's great. So over this discussion, we have sort of seen, whether this whole policy was marketed as sort of this pseudo environmental based policy using lingo in the documents and reports, and also comparisons between countries, and how there's a US policy which is pretty recent to sort of counter China it links with the larger international relations issues, and also how the Chinese are largely gaining from it and sort of using the position of the weaker emerging economies to their advantage. And also, we talked about the general cons of the OBOR policy in terms of the environmental impact, in terms of costs, transportation costs, in terms of health risks that are largely posed. Yeah, so that concludes the discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining in. Thank you so much.